So in Screencast 2, I want to look at some of the hard facts and figures, the evidence for the social and economic impact of sport and physical activity. So what we are doing is we are looking at the logic model that we looked at the end of Screencast 1, and we're trying to ascribe some values to some of these outcomes. Okay, so through investing in programs to increase sport participation, what's the value of some of these outcomes? What are some of the externalities? What are some of the savings and the benefits that accrue to broader society? And the source of this information is literally brand new. So this document was published at the end of August or early September this year, so it is weeks old. And it was completed by the Sport Industry Research Centre at Sheffield Hallam University on behalf of Sport England. So this is the first full assessment which uses the logic model to look at the total value of sport and physical activity in the UK. And remember last week when we looked at the circular flow of income, we said that probably underestimated the value of the sport economy because it didn't include the value of voluntary sector work. So that significantly underestimated the value of sport to the economy. And that circular flow of income also, it excludes the value of social return on investment. And health economics has for quite a long time looked at the costs of various diseases and various clinical interventions, the costs and benefits of those. But if you think about sport as a kind of social and medical intervention, with those externalities, we really haven't had a model up till now which tries to ascribe some value to some of those savings. So this is a big contribution that CERC have made to the area of sport economics. And if you want to read the document in more detail, you can find the link to it here on this slide. Okay, I will also put a copy of the document in the week 3 Blackboard, in the week 3 folder in learning materials on the module Blackboard site. So what are some of the headlines from the social return on investment? So remember, social return on investment suggests that there is some investment made into sport, and here we can see the inputs. Yeah, so we've got a scale down here and we've got some inputs. Okay, and over here we've got the outcomes, so the externalities, the results of the investment in sport. So what we can see here is on the input side, and in the next slide we'll break this down a little bit more, we can see that the public sector makes an investment of £2.44 billion into the sport economy in the UK. We'll break that down a little bit more on the next slide. We can see that participants, through their spending on admission fees, memberships, equipment, clothing, contribute £13.7 billion to the economy. And we can see that volunteers' contribution using this model, and this is just for community participation. This isn't volunteers' contribution to volunteering to help host major sports events. This is just volunteers in clubs doing coaching, officiating at matches, keeping clubs running on a day-to-day basis. The value of those inputs is £5.7 billion, which gives us a total input using this model of £21.85 billion. Right? So what does the country get back from this investment? What do society and individuals within that society get back as a return? Well, here are some of the outcomes, and we can see the outcomes are under 4 main headings: physical and mental health, mental well-being, individual development, and social and community development. Well, I'll talk about these a little bit more in detail as we go through. But you can see here under physical and mental health, this looks at the positive health impacts that participation in sport and physical activity has on these health conditions. And the estimate from CERC is that this makes a saving. So participation in sport and physical activity can be ascribed a figure of £9.59 billion of current savings to the health budget and the mental health budget in the UK. That is to say, if we did not have physical activity and sport participation, if it all ceased, the physical and mental health budget would have to increase by £9.59 billion to accommodate the costs of treating these diseases. Okay, so those are the savings. The people who do sport, they save themselves their own health issues, but they also saved the health budget £9.59 billion. Now, in the report as well, and I don't have slides on it here, the report does talk about if we could increase participation in sport by 100,000 people, right? So that's 100,000 people in England out of a population of about 55 million people. This would save us an additional X million pounds per year. So we can see that, you know, if we can invest in sport in a better way so as to increase participation, we can actually increase savings to the government. Mental well-being. So this is a big one. Yeah. So the mental well-being, the well-being feelings of positivity and general feeling content, happy, well, these can be ascribed in the CERC model a value of £41 billion. So this looks at anyone who has done any sport, doesn't have to be that frequent, any sport at least once in the previous year, and it describes a certain value to that feeling of health and well-being. We'll look at some of the figures a little bit later on in a few slides. Individual development. This is approved educational attainment and enhanced human capital. So this is linking to what we looked at in the week 2 lecture when we looked at the increased earning potential that having a degree and being a graduate and doing sport actually provides to individuals. And this is worth £282 billion. And then down here we've got social and community development. Now, this involves things like crime reduction, right? And it also includes something called social capital. Some of you may have heard of social capital, others will not. Social capital, if we have high levels of social capital, that means we have high levels of trust and empathy and a feeling of connectivity. So it's a kind of social glue and bond which bonds us to other members in society. And it means that we trust them. It means that we have less fear that they're going to do us harm. It means that we are more likely to become involved in our local communities. Now, research has been done on this, and areas which have high social capital tend to be more affluent and more content. Okay, so what CERC have done here in compiling this model is they've ascribed a value to that. Okay, so the outcome of all these kind of externalities, the total value of externalities, CERC reckon is £71.6 billion. So for an investment inputs of £21 billion into the participation end of the sports market, this doesn't include the elite sports market. So if we include the elite sport market and inputs and costs to run and host events against the economic impact of those, and spectating and so on, then the likelihood is it would be higher again. But this is just from participation sport, grassroots community participation sport, inputs of £21 billion and outcomes of £71 billion. Now, down at the bottom is a social return on investment calculation. All this has done is it has taken the total value of outcomes, £71.6 billion, and this is divided by the inputs, £21.85 billion, and this tells us that SROI is 3.28. So in other words, for every £1 of input, £3.28, £3.28 worth of social impacts are generated. So what this is saying is that sport is a good investment to make. You invest in sport, you get a lot back in terms of health, benefits, mental well-being, social capital, and individual development and education outcomes. Okay, so that's the headline. Let's just look at a bit more detail. So this breaks down some of the inputs. So this is going to be useful to you when you come to your diagram that we're working on in this week's face-to-face, although now it has now moved online, in this week's face-to-face but online group session. So you're going to be working on your diagram, and down the right hand side we looked at government investment in sport at the national and the local levels. We said that at the international levels there wasn't really a supranational or an international government. Government happened at national levels. So what we can see here is that total public and government sector spending is £2.4 billion. And this is made up of £267 million which Sport England receives and invests on behalf of the government. And this is made up of lottery money and exchequer. Exchequer money is separate than lottery money. Lottery money is purely from money which people spend on buying lottery tickets. Exchequer is tax money. So income tax, corporation tax, and sales tax, value-added tax. This is exchequer money, okay? But Sport England receives this amount of money. And what you'll find also is that other central government departments, you've got secondary schools and higher education institutions who spend £588 million on sport provision. We've got Department of Transport spending on cycling and walking, which interestingly is more than spending on sport. And then we've got Public Health England, who spend a small amount on physical activity programmes. So really Public Health England, you know, to say the health benefits, they don't really input a lot of money into sport and physical activity programmes, just £3.8 million. But I suppose it could be argued that investment is going into this through other government departments. And then we've got the Youth Sport Trust. And the Youth Sport Trust is responsible for developing opportunities for young people, particularly around school sport and equality, PE experience, but also linking young people into sports clubs to try to get them to continue their participation. And the Youth Sport Trust invests £6.34 million per year, which receives from government. So that is central government expenditure, although we'd need to exclude higher education institutions from the overall secondary school expenditure. Further down the chain at the local level, we have local authorities, and we can see that local authorities are by far the biggest investor into community sport in the public and government sector, and they spend £1.187 billion. Okay, so those are the government sector expenditures. What we can see here is that from the consumer expenditure, the consumer sector, consumers' expenditure on community level sports participation it accounts for £13.7 billion worth of expenditure in the sports economy, and this is made up of these components. So we can see that activity charges and fees, so gym memberships, entrance to swimming pools, booking of courts in sports halls at sports centres, that is the biggest component. And then we've got equipment costs and clothing and footwear costs and travel costs. And then we've got the value, the non-financial inputs from the informal sector of the economy. And we've got the value of volunteers' time for participation sport, not for kind of elite sport, and volunteers' time helping in major events, which will be significant as well. But we can see that that's £5.7 billion. So that gives us our total of just under £22 billion of inputs. Okay, so that's how we break down some of the inputs on the left-hand side of the scales here. So those are the inputs, and that's where the inputs come from. And some of that will be useful to you in completing your diagrams, which we're going to look at in this week's small group seminar live online sessions. Now, how did CERC ascribe some values to some of those outcomes? Well, what has been done here is based on research and evidence. So previously published peer review, usually high quality information, so substantial studies which are well regarded and are believed to be highly accurate. We can see here that coronary heart disease, for example, and I'm not going to read down all of these, coronary heart disease, so people who meet the government's recommended levels for sport and physical activity of moderate intensity for 150 minutes a week. So that means 30 minutes at least moderate intensity activity in sport or physical activity on 5 days a week to give us 150 minutes, reduces the risk of coronary heart disease and stroke in adults by 35%. Okay, so what we can then do is look at NHS budgets and the per capita spend on the English population of treating coronary heart disease in the NHS. We can look at, through looking at participation data, the number of individuals who are meeting the government's recommended levels of 150 minutes per week, and we can knock off 35% of their costs for coronary heart disease, and that is the positive externality associated with sports participation and improved coronary health. Okay, so we can look at that and we can go down each of these and see how CERC have calculated the value of these benefits. Okay, now I won't read down all of these. You can read the report yourselves, but you'll see that there's a kind of colour coding against some of these things, and this is to do with the quality of evidence. So as the quality of evidence gets better, as the studies get better which underpin this, so SROI should become more accurate. What CERC would say to you is that in the absence of very strong evidence, we have been conservative in the way we have calculated benefits. So, evidence quality. Anything which is coloured gold is high quality, robust evidence. Okay. Anything which is coloured silver is moderate quality evidence that falls short of the highest quality. Yeah. And then bronze, we've got persuasive evidence, but the scale and scope of evidence might be limited. So if we look at this, for example, and criminal incidences, there is some evidence, although it is only categorised as bronze level quality information, that sport participation leads to a 1% reduction in criminal incidents for males aged 10 to 24 years, right? So we could look at the number of young people who meet recommended levels of activity for young people. We could look at the total cost of criminal incidences for males aged 10 to 24 years, and we could knock 1% off the proportion that is allocated to the percentage of young people aged 10 to 24 who meet the government recommended levels of sport. Okay, so that is the information, and that's the quality of information. Okay, so let's look at some more detail. So again, I'm not going to look at this in detail, but I'm just going to make you aware of some of the figures. So this is our £9.5 billion of value in terms of health benefits associated with physical activity, and this is kind of reduce health costs. So we can see that if we look at people who may have suffered from coronary heart disease who are meeting government recommended levels, this gives us a kind of 150,942 individuals. The cost per annum of treating these people would be £7,000. So if we multiply £7,000 by 150,000 individuals, this gives us an impact value, right? So we can see all of these things, and we can see that, the big savings, and I've mentioned this before, I said that, if obesity keeps on increasing at the level it's increasing, the treatment of type 2 diabetes will swallow up the bulk of the current value of the NHS budget by something like 2050. So we can see that here, that, treating type 2 diabetes is the biggest cost to the NHS, because it's a chronic rather than acute condition. It means that people live with it for many years, but the cost of treating them is substantial, and it runs for many, many years as well. And also we can see that as an ageing population, that dementia also is significant, and we know that vascular dementia the risks of that certainly can be reduced significantly by moderate intensity physical activity. Okay. We can also see down here as well that there is a kind of negative externality, that people who take part in sport are more likely to experience an injury which might require hospital treatment, or may require some time off work, or may require a visit to a GP, and that this has got so 283,000 participants per year may experience an injury, and the value or the cost of each injury is nearly £5,500. So this equates to £1 billion, which needs to come off the overall total benefit above. So this is looking at costs as well as benefits. Okay. So how do we arrive at some of these overall costs? Well, again, I'm just going to run through this quickly. The total costs associated with ill health and treating health can be healthcare costs. Yeah. So the actual cost to the NHS. It can be productivity loss due to mortality, so people dying early before their time, and lost earnings, so people who could have been productive in the economy and who've died early and lost earnings. We've got productivity loss due to morbidity, so this is disease and time off work, so sickness absence. This is worth £126 million per year. Informal care costs. Then there are social care costs. You won't see some of them down here, but you will see that the social care costs of dementia, the savings that can be made here are £1.3 billion. The savings of unpaid care, so these are individuals and family members who don't work so that they can look after relatives suffering from dementia. This is kind of £1.5 billion. So you can see the enormous costs of dementia there. So that's why dementia, although it doesn't have kind of, productivity and morbidity costs, it does have big costs in terms of social care and unpaid care. So this is just the way some of these things are broken down, and the costs are under each of these domains. So to me, it's interesting to look at this, because for years we've talked about, the value of physical activity in improving health, and now we can look at different areas and see sports contribution to this. So this is, this is kind of stuff that's difficult to see. It's not spending that circulates in the economy, but it's kind of, stuff that could be freed up, stuff that is freed up that otherwise would need to be paid for by taxation, or would have other impacts on public spending, because we'd have to replace public spending which is saved by sport. It would have an impact on the ability to deliver other services in the public sector. Mental health well-being valuation. So this looks at all participants who did any physical activity in the last year. Okay, now some of these figures are for individuals who actually do 150 minutes of activity per week. Okay, so these are the number of people who kind of suffer, but this is kind of, these figures are the number of individuals. So this quantity is the number of people in the population who did sport at least once a year. And this has been given a value of £1,200 or £1,274, which comes out at an overall impact value of £31 million, right? Volunteers feel better for putting something back, and they feel better to a tune of £2,663 per person if we ascribe a value to it, and that's worth £10 billion. So the mental well-being valuation is worth £41 billion. Individual valuation, we talked about this last week, so I don't propose to talk about that too long. And then we've got the value to community development and crime reduction, and we can see some of the values that are associated with that, which comes to £19 billion. Okay, so this is the overall summary. So we can see the total inputs, we can see the total value of each area: physical and mental health, mental well-being, individual development, and social and community development. And we can also see the breakdown under each of those areas. Okay, but the 21 billion, nearly 22 billion investment returns over £71.5 billion of benefits, which gives us a SROI, social return on investment, of 3.28. So for every £1 spent, every £1 of inputs generates £3.28 worth of outcomes. Now, if we think about that £71 billion, which is the social return on investment, those kind of non-market, indirect benefits, externalities of sport, and we add to that the direct spending in the economy on sport and physical activity. Yeah, so this is sport and activity participation. So if we add the social value to the economic value, the actual flows of money in the economy, community sport and physical activity has a social and economic value of £85.5 billion, right? So this is likely to be a more accurate estimation of the worth of the sports economy, the total value of the sports economy in England. So it's not the £20 billion that we looked at in week 2. Once we add in the voluntary sector and the social benefits, it's actually worth £85.5 billion, which is a strong rationale for government wanting to be involved and making sure that the benefits are spread as widely and as equitably across different social groups as possible. So if we add in the economic impact of sport as well as the social impact, we have £1 spent in sport gives us £4 in return, right? So it's up from £3.28. Once we add in the economic benefit, it gives us a £4 return. Okay, so what I want to look at next in Screencast 3 is an economic theory, and we're going to look at and say, well, if the government didn't get involved, what might the risks be, and how likely would it be that if the government wasn't involved, that we would see these values of returns on investment, that we would see an £85.5 billion sport contribution to the economy, of which £71 billion is generated in social and economic benefits. So in Screencast 3, I want to look at the market mechanism, something called the invisible hand, and discuss concepts of market failure and provide therefore a rationale for government involvement in the sport economy.